our president is sitting down and negotiating with the regime of Iran. Iran has probably been responsible for more American deaths than any singular terrorist group. It is undisputably the largest supporter of terrorism in the world.
The words of former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani as we welcome you back for the final hour of America's Forum on this Wednesday, alongside Miranda Khan, J.D. Hayworth here. And Miranda, in that speech, Rudy basically said all terror roads lead back into Tehran, Iran.
He did. Iran has been linked to several terrorists, and the U.S. even recognizes the regime as the world's leading sponsor of terrorism. So many are asking, why is our president negotiating with terrorists?
Let's go in depth on this, and we are joined by Ali Safavi, the U.S. spokesman for the National Council of Resistance of Iran. He's also the president of the Near East Policy Research Center, and he joins us from Washington, D.C. Likewise, from Newsmax Washington. For the entire hour, we're pleased to welcome in Republican strategist Ford O'Connell. To you both, our thanks. Welcome. And Ali, where has Iran been most active in supporting terror?
Well, first of all, good morning, JD, and thanks for having me. Well, the genesis to the current rise of fundamentalist Islam goes back to 1979, when the mullahs usurped the leadership of the 1979 revolution, and they made one of the pillars of the regime, their strategy, was to export of terrorism and fundamentalism beyond Iranian borders. And of course, they've been active all over the place, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen now, and of course in Afghanistan. And so clearly, I think when you talk about the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, you cannot ignore the fact that the Iranian regime has acted as the godfather, if you will, of this dangerous phenomenon that is threatening not only regional peace, but also international and global security.
Ali, why does the White House insist on downplaying the fact that Iran is the biggest state sponsor of Islamic terrorism, particularly as these negotiations go forward? What is their interest in not letting the American public know this?
Well, I think that the administration is so much focused on striking a nuclear deal with the Iranian regime at any cost that unfortunately it is ignoring the many egregious actions of this regime, both within Iran and outside the country. The fact is that Iran is not only the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, it is the #1 per capita executioner of its own citizens at home. And so obviously raising those issues with the mullahs in Tehran, the administration perhaps feels, will adversely affect their negotiations with them over the nuclear weapons program. But I think that you have to look at this issue sort of in a package. You cannot address the nuclear problem in a piecemeal fashion. They are all parts of the same thing. The nuclear program of Iran, its export of terrorism, and its suppression of its citizenry. They are all part of the same game that the regime has been playing ever since it took power in Iran 36 years ago. So I would think that thinking that by being nice to the mullahs of Iran and ignoring their mischief all over the world and in the region would somehow lead to some favorable deal on the nuclear issue, I think is at best very naive.
Ali, Iran has tried to basically distance itself from ISIS, but some claim that, don't fall for it, that it actually has its hand in ISIS. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that when you look at the problem of ISIS, I think ISIS is a new phenomenon. It's just, I guess, it emerged this year. But let's not forget that it was the Iranian regime's support for his puppet Maliki in Iraq that sowed sectarian strife in that country, that marginalized the Sunnis in that country, that gave rise to ISIS, which took advantage of Sunni dissatisfaction in Iraq. And by the same token, you have to remember that it was the Iranian regime which funded, trained, and armed the Shiite militias in Iraq, which are, if not as equal to ISIS in terms of their brutality, they're exactly doing the same thing as ISIS does. Case in point, the recent attack by Shiite militias to a village in northern Iraq in which they killed 72 innocent civilians. And so in that sense, I think that when you look at Iran, they are the main benefactor of what ISIS is doing in Syria and Iraq right now. Why? Because it diverts attention from the regime itself, but also I think it raises the question as to whether it would make sense to partner with the mullahs to try to defeat ISIS, which at least
And we will have to leave it right there. Ali Safavi, Ford O'Connell, stand by. We will continue our conversation as America's Forum continues right here from Newsmax TV. Back now on America's Forum with Miranda Khan, J.D. Hayworth. Miranda, we've been focusing on the Middle East,
Right.
but Argentina may be linked to Iran in a huge scandal, the 1994 bombing that killed 85 people at a Jewish center in Argentina.
Yeah, the link was uncovered by one Argentina's federal prosecutor, Alberto Nisman, who announced Iran was behind that attack. Nisman was found dead shortly after accusing the president and other top officials of trying to cover up a deal to shield Iranians from responsibility in that bombing.
Rejoin us to continue the conversation, Ali Safavi, the U.S. spokesman for the National Council of Resistance of Iran and the president of Near East Policy Research, also on hand, as he will be the entire hour, Republican strategist Ford O'Connell.
And Ali, how do you know if Iran was actually involved in that bombing?
Well, as you might imagine, just as with the Iranian regime's clandestine nuclear weapons program, the Iranian resistance and the NCRI had very, very concrete and accurate information that the decision to attack AMIA was made by the Iranian regime's National Security Council back in August of 1993, actually August 14th, 1993. And from that day until July 1994, Iranian intelligence agents made 70 trips to Argentina to prepare the grounds for that heinous attack. People who made the decision for this terrorist attack were, of course, the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, then the President Hashemi Rafsanjani, the current President of Iran, which is dubbed as a moderate, Hassan Rouhani, who was a member of the National Security Council, the Iranian regime's Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Velayati, and the commander of the Iranian regime's Quds, the elite Quds force at that time, Ahmad Vahidi. And of course, they used several surrogates, including a mullah by the name of Rabbani, Mohsen Rabbani, who was acting as the cultural attaché of the Iranian embassy in Buenos Aires. And of course, you had Imam.
Ali,
as well.
quick question. I can't wrap my head around this. Why would Argentina help Iran? What's in it for them to cover this up if the allegations are indeed true?
Well, to be honest, I don't know. That is something that perhaps an impartial investigation for which the Iranian resistance's leader, Mrs. Rajavi, has called for will determine. So I don't know whether the Iranian regime has any kind of financial dealings with the Argentinian government or not, but there's no question that when it comes to the attack itself, it was clearly something that was planned and carried out by the Iranian regime, and no amount of cover-up can prevent the truth from coming up.
Well, cover-up being the operative term, at least in terms of Argentina, Ali, that's the suspicion, because the president of Argentina, now very much under suspicion, publicly, of course, Argentina says it wants the U.S. help it to get to the bottom of this by including raising the issue during these nuclear talks with Iran. In your opinion, is that simply a strategic ruse on the part of the Argentinian government, or do you think Iran would be obliging to even talk about this act of terror, this bombing of the Jewish center so many years ago in Argentina?
As you may know, the Iranian regime has made it very clear that the only issue that it will address in the talks with the United States and P5+1 is the nuclear issue. And so as to whether something like that would be effective in getting to the bottom of this case, I don't think that would be the case. But there's no question, there's ample evidence that the Iranian regime planned and carried out this attack. And unfortunately, it seems to me, in this case, as well as many, many other cases, 450 assassinations of Iranian dissidents abroad, and the Khobar Tower bombing, the Beirut Marine bombing, the U.S. Embassy bombing in Kuwait, and many, many more, the Iranian regime has been let off the hook, precisely because I think of the naive perception that somehow if you accommodate them, if you play nice to them, that they will reciprocate. That is absolutely not the case. Remember, the Iranian regime is the epicenter of terrorism in the world today, and it's acting very much like what Moscow was acting in the heydays of the Soviet Union for the communist world. The Iranian regime is doing exactly the same thing for terrorist groups, for radical fundamentalist groups such as ISIS and Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and the Tuareg in Mali, and of course the Boko Haram in Nigeria. So I think, quite frankly, that you need more than just behind the scenes, if you will, admonishment of Iran. You need an international effort, a very clear effort, a very firm effort to try to hold the Iranian regime to account. And I think, quite frankly,
we will have to leave it right there. Ali Safavi, we know you work hard on behalf of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. We thank you for your time. When we come back, we're talking weather, climate change, and the big freeze.